بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الكريم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to our weekly webinar. And if you recall, previously we were looking at some of the objections to the famous cosmological argument for the existence of God. And when you look at the wording for the cosmological argument, you have the first proposition: anything with a beginning must have a cause. The second proposition: the universe has a beginning. And the third, or the conclusion: therefore the universe must have a cause. Obviously that cause is Allah, because he's the its existence, preferred existence over its non-existence. So therefore referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now what we were looking at last week was some of the objections to some of the propositions. So we looked at one of the objections that was made was against the proposition: anything with a beginning must have a cause. And as we remember, one of the main proponents of this argument was the English philosopher David Hume, coming from the empiricist school, where he denied the necessity for a cause for the beginning. But as you can rightly understand, a lot of people responded to him, and his argument is no longer as valid. Even in 1754, John Stuart, whilst writing to John Stuart, he himself acknowledged the absurdity of the proposition that anything might arise without a cause. And in our daily lives, we don't, even a small child realizes that if something happens, then there has to be a cause. So that was the main primary contention against that first proposition. When it came to the second proposition, that the universe has a beginning, here we looked at some alternative explanations to the theory of the Big Bang. We looked at how there have been certain proponents who've tried to offer alternative explanations, but they've been unsuccessful, and they've been dismissed by the scientific world. And it has the Big Bang theory becoming one of the more dominant views to explain the beginning of the universe. As we also discuss the oscillating universe model, again, this idea of the universe expanding for a period, then collapsing and contracting, and then expanding again. And then this process repeats itself. And that this view that the universe at its core is pre-eternal without any definitive beginning, but it is a constant of volatility of expansion and contraction. Again, when we looked at it last week, we talked about how it doesn't deal with several potential contentions, and doesn't explain the fine tuning and also the nature of the beginning of the universe. We also looked at the eternal inflation model. Again, this is a model which has evolved from the Big Bang theory, but again, they all lack acceptability within the scientific world, since it doesn't kind of answer the common objections. And again, we looked at some of these previously, so we don't need to spend too much time on that. Now we're going to move on to a new one. So one of the objections to the conclusion, so now we're talking, we've looked at the objections against the proposition. Now we're looking at the objection against the conclusion. And the conclusion is that Allah, God, is the one who brought the universe out of nothingness into existence. So it is Allah who brought the universe out of existence, out of non-existence into existence. Now, so the first objection will be, why Allah? As in, why God? Why can't there be an alternative explanation? And so the background of this objection is that even if it is assumed that there is a cause behind the existence or the emergence of the world, how is Allah suddenly automatically assumed to be the cause? Why can't there be something else? And this is obviously one of the most famous objections used by atheists. It's the one that Richard Dawkins also uses in his book, The God Delusion. And what they do is, and this is where you will see the fallacy, they start focusing on some of the attributes of Allah and then try to argue how it is not possible for these to be his attributes, the attributes of God. And again, we'll look at that, because again, this is just evading the argument, because it's actually talking about a separate issue and not dealing with the crux of the argument itself. And so whoever uses this as an argument, ultimately you need to realize that they're jumping ship. They're jumping from the central point of the argument and not tackling the issue, and now jumping to another argument. So it's important that you recognize this strategy that's used by some of the atheists. Now, one of the most significant areas of difference between atheism and theism is the belief of the atheists in matter, and that there is no cause behind matter, right? And as you can see, that's deeply problematic and unscientific. Whilst those who believe in God, the theists, their argument implies that there is this super material cause that allowed the world to come into existence. Now, this is the part of the evidence which is the kind of the rational indicator of Allah's existence, namely that it is Allah who brought his entire creation and universe into existence. Now, the argument proves a number of issues related to the nature of this cause, and which makes it a useful argument to prove the existence of Allah. As well as some of his attributes. Again, not all of his attributes. This particular argument doesn't prove all of the attributes of God, but at least some of them. And they're important, because if the universe came into existence after nothingness, right? So there was nothingness, and then the universe came into existence, the cause must be a creator through whom this universe was created. As in, there has to be a creator who brought this universe into existence. Now, a few things that we know that we can learn from this, from the base of these rational arguments. Firstly is that he must be pre-eternal. This creator who brought the universe into existence must be pre-eternal. Now, again, this answers the question that someone asked last week about who created Allah. And I will look at that still in more detail, but this automatically responds to that, because you can't have a series of causes, right? There has to be a stop somewhere where you have the infinite, because otherwise you have the infinite causality. So in other words, I think we've looked at these kind of examples before. And I think one of the examples we gave, and the one that Ustad Hamza Zotzis uses in his book as well, that if there was someone who was about to be executed, and there was someone who was now holding a gun ready to shoot this person to execute him, but for this person to shoot the gun, they need permission from the person above them, right? And then also for the person above them to give the permission to the person to shoot, they also need permission from this person above them. And then also that person needs a permission from someone above them. And if you continue going in the past like this, infinite regress, then there would never be a time where this one person would be able to shoot and kill, execute the person, because you're constantly requiring permission from someone that comes before. But when it comes to the universe does exist. It's there, you can see it, which means there has to be a first cause, which is pre-eternal and doesn't require a cause, right? and the universe needs a cause, and that's why it is atemporal. So the emergence of the universe demonstrates that the creator must be um, must be uh, infinite, must be pre-eternal. That's one thing that we can learn about the attributes of this creator or God. Secondly, the emergence of the universe has certain very unique features, which makes it necessary that the one who brought it into existence has a will, right? Has a will. The point, because the creator is the one who carried out these actions through his own volition, through his own will. So another thing we can learn from this is that the doer, the one who did the action, because he did it with his own volition, must have a will, right? So we've demonstrated must be pre-eternal. Secondly, that he must have a will, because he willed for the universe to come into existence at a particular point in time. Thirdly, that the doer of this action, because he's doing it on his own will, must be someone who's alive. It can't be something that's dead, right? A dead actor wouldn't bring the universe into existence. So we also know that this being must be a living being. Also, we learn that for something like the universe to come into existence requires immense power, right? And therefore, for this event, the universe to come into existence requires someone who also has the attributes of power and might, right? So these are the acts of the universe creation suggests some of these perfect attributes of Allah, which is that he must be pre-eternal, must have a will, must be living, and must have power. So these are the points that are essential in our discussion with an atheist when it comes to the beginning of the universe. Now, the point of this argument is not, and this is important to remember, the point of this argument is not to prove the existence of Allah with all of his perfect attributes, right? So, someone talking about mercy, someone talking about, wisdom, knowledge, this, that. Currently, this particular argument itself is not where we learn about all of the other attributes. We have obviously the Quran and other sources by which we learn about the other attributes of Allah. What is important, and the reason I'm stressing this is where the atheists with their argument fail, right? Because they're trying to now bring into the discussion other attributes, and they're trying to make a point, but that's not the point for this particular argument. As long as you can prove that the person who created the thing that created the universe was a being of power and did it by their will and choice, this is all that's required to be proved. Anything beyond these basic attributes, it doesn't fall under this argument and cannot be proven through this particular form of rational evidence. Now, you can, as I said, use other arguments like the teleological argument, the scriptural evidence, and so on to demonstrate and prove the other attributes of Allah. But here, that is not required. And therefore, when the atheist tries to bring the discussion about other of the attributes of Allah and trying to cause objections to certain attributes, that's actually a fallacy in their argument, because this particular argument is only focusing on certain attributes of Allah. And so long as those attributes can be demonstrated through this argument, that is sufficient to prove that that cause is actually Allah. I hope you're understanding, or you've understood that argument, and understand that it's an error to bring in other parts or other arguments into the discussion by the atheists, and not moving away from the central argument. So that's the objection to the conclusion God is the one who brought the universe into nothingness, into existence. Now, then you have the second objection. And this is also a well-known objection used by the atheists. This is what's known as the God of the gaps, the God of the gaps. So what the atheist says, the theists, the answer to the question, what is the cause for the emergence of the world with Allah, is ignorance of causality. So it is as if the atheists are filling in, the theists are filling in the gaps because they don't know another explanation. Therefore, they're jumping and they're basically saying God is the explanation. And what they're trying to say is that this position is a position of ignorance because they don't know how to answer the cause or the explanation for the cause of the universe. Now, the theist, the believer, like you can see here, say the Muslim, they emphasize that this is not an ignorant stand of theirs. The whole argument of the God of the gaps is the universe came into existence. The atheists are trying to say that this is what the theists, the believers, are doing. They're saying the universe came into existence. They don't have an explanation for it. So therefore now they jump to God as an explanation. But what actually is happening in the thesis is saying, no, we're not just jumping in out of ignorance and saying God is the explanation. We're not appealing to ignorance. Rather, we're using evidence to demonstrate the veracity of the argument, right? This is important to understand because this is again another fallacy in the argument of the atheists. When we affirm the existence of the creator, it is not based on our inability to explain the ultimate cause of the universe. It's not that, well, we can't explain what's the cause of the universe, that's why we're making a blind leap of faith and we're using God to solve the problem. Rather, our belief is a result of a set of rational and also, as we mentioned before, fitra, instinctive prepositions that offers this conclusion, right? This is crucial to understand as a way to prove this point, because our belief of Allah being the cause for the existence of the universe is based on our knowledge, not ignorance. It is therefore, because we know, as we said previously before, we know, it is proven earlier that the universe is temporal. It's not been there forever. It's temporal, and it is therefore either temporal with a cause behind it or without a cause. Now, to say it's the latter, as in without the cause, that's impossible, and we've already explained why that is the case. So therefore, a cause would be either the temporal entity itself, as in it created itself, or something different. Now, the former is also impossible, as we've mentioned before, and we looked at it from the Quranic argument as well, that universe cannot create itself, and therefore the explanation is that it has come into existence by something separate from the universe itself. And this separate cause itself must either be temporal or atemporal. We've said why it can't be temporal, because then you would have an infinite causality, which is again impossible. Therefore, again, this is purely from a rational argument. Therefore, our claim, our position, to demonstrate that God is the explanation for the existence of the universe is not a position out of ignorance, is not us filling in the gap because we don't have an alternative explanation. Rather, it is a rational answer that relies upon clear evidences and propositions. So that's a quick way to explain this. And that's why, for example, Richard Swinburne, in his book, Is There a God? He critiques this objection himself by saying, note that I am not postulating a God of the gaps. a God merely to explain the things which science has not yet explained. I am postulating a God to explain what science explains. I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. The very success of science in showing us how deeply orderly the natural world is provides strong grounds for believing that there is an even deeper cause of that order. Okay, so that hopefully responds to what's known as the God of the gaps. The objection in the argument of the God of the gaps is, since currently science cannot explain the cause for the universe, the believers, out of ignorance, are jumping and making a blind leap of saying that God is the explanation. And the response to that objection is by demonstrating that we are not making a blind leap by saying God is an explanation, but rather we are using rational arguments based on the propositions to demonstrate that God is the explanation for the cause of the universe. Okay, now let's look at the next objection. I know we're quickly running out of time. The third objection, which again is used by quite a few modern day atheists, is basically, why the haste? What's the rush? Science will one day give us an explanation. Science will one day reveal the cause of the universe. Now, this objection is deeply problematic. And again, I think Ustad Imran I think in the course in level 6, where we look at science, Islam, and evolution, he touches upon this point as well, which is to do with scientism, this assumption that science is the sole, science itself can explain everything, right? Which is a deeply problematic position. Because clearly science is not the only way to get an explanation of a phenomenon. There are other ways to understand information as well, and it's not purely restricted to science. So the atheists draw their so again, it's to do with the philosophy that they take on from a purely materialistic perspective. They have faith in only what the empirical science dictates, and they accept only natural material explanations for phenomena. Anything which is supernatural or supranatural, they don't want to, they basically take, and again, that's a philosophical position they're taking, right? They take this position that there is no room for any supernatural or metaphysical explanation. So anything related to God, anything related to Jannah, Jahannam, anything that's beyond the scope of science itself, they would find objectionable. Now, though the natural and empirical knowledge is able to offer plenty of information on the natural phenomena, this does not mean that it's able to offer knowledge in all possible fields. And it is a great mistake to restrict the source of knowledge only to science, because the pathways to knowledge are varied. It's not limited to just one field, but it's varied, and the fields of knowledge are varied as well. And therefore, an objection by the atheists, by simply referring to a future of science that is unknown, which they claim will ultimately reveal the cause of the universe, is in reality ignorance. And what they are actually doing is they're actually doing what they're accusing us of, which is blind faith. They have a blind faith in the unknown, in the unseen future, claiming that possibly sometime down the line there will be a scientific explanation. And again, as you can see, this is deeply problematic. And it's all based on, and as you see, when you look at the writings of these atheists, they start from this position, which is to deny the existence of Allah. They don't want, no matter what, they do not want to start with the acceptance of the possibility of the existence of Allah. And again, that's not because of the cosmological or other arguments, because of other issues, right? They might have had certain issues in their life, and we'll talk about that as well. And that leads to these kind of objections. So now they have this attitude there already, and they're casting Allah outside of the scientific scene, in order for them to then make sure that fulfill their philosophical implications, because for them to even assume the possibility of the existence of Allah would become deeply problematic for them. So they are forced now to accept any alternative scientific theory simply because they insist on not having Allah as an answer. They don't want Allah as a possibility, as an answer to be part of the equation, and therefore they are going to accept any alternative scientific theory, no matter how ridiculous it may be. So with the new atheists, since they are so dependent on science and scientism, they now take this almost like a bigoted view of anyone who's trying to explain anything beyond the scope of science. And this demonstrates a deep methodological flaw in their thinking, right? And so look, the point here is to emphasize that the state of atheism stops short of following the rational implications of the evidence in front of them, that will ultimately lead them to Allah. And again, this goes back to their preconceived biases against the possibility of Allah's existence. And that's why they come by these explanations, a blind faith in the possibility that in the future there might be some kind of explanation to explain this unknown. And so really, they cannot accuse the believers of blind faith, when in reality, that's what they are doing with blind faith. Because again, when you go back to the arguments, when you talk about the existence of the universe, there has to be an explanation. And that explanation for that has to be an eternal uncaused cause. And that explanation is Allah. They do not want to explain except this rational argument. Therefore, they are now going to go into alternative explanations, or even making a blind faith leap that in the future there will be an explanation. Okay, now the next one is actually a bit detailed, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, even though we do have the presentation. Let me see if we can. Let me quickly do this one, and then we can leave the next one for another time. The fourth objection is that the universe has no cause at all, or that it caused itself. Now, again, purely just by our fitrah, we would reject this argument, right? That the universe has no cause at all, or that it caused itself. And you have certain writers who have, for example, there's a book called The Grand Design that claims that because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, the problem in this passage comes even when you do the basic cursory of investigations, because when you talk about gravity, gravity is describing the natural phenomenon that is present across the universe, which could not have existed before the universe existed, right? To say that gravity is the explanation is assuming that the gravity was there before the existence of the universe, but the gravity did not exist before the universe. So how could it therefore be the cause for the universe coming into existence? It just makes no sense. And so again, when atheists go down this path, they discard some of the rational explanations, and they come up with these crazy explanations that the universe came into existence from nothing. Now, this problem becomes deeply problematic because it also goes contrary to what we know about science itself and about rationality and how you have causes and how certain things bring things into existence. And therefore, they're basically abandoning all of these rational points to go with this blind view of the universe creating itself or causing its own existence. So how can someone comprehend that the universe emerged from nothingness, but then he seeks out the causes that are behind those events that he witnesses? Would he be convinced if he were to be rendered unable of knowing that the cause came about without cause? Like, for example, let's say you have recently, as you all know, we had coronavirus, right? The pandemic. Imagine someone just said, coronavirus just came into existence out of nothing. Like, we don't need the scientific world to look into, to do the discovery, to find out what was the cause, what started it, and so on. It just came into existence from nothing. No one would take such a scientist seriously, right? If someone, um, if someone came with an empty hat and then, a rabbit just emerged from it, surely you're going to look for an explanation. Where did the rabbit come from? Normally, what seems to be an empty hat in reality is not empty, and the hat is actually split into two, though it may appear to be an empty hat. In reality, it's not empty, or that the rabbit came from somewhere else. No one just says, oh, that you don't need an explanation for the cause. No one would take such a person seriously. But then this is exactly what the atheists are telling us to do, to come up with these kind of explanations which just make no sense. And the most famous one of them, and again, you might have seen Ustad Hamza Zotzi's debate with Lawrence Krauss. In his book, he claims that the universe, as per the laws of space physics, comes out into existence from nothingness, right? That's what he's claiming. The universe comes into existence from nothingness. Now, when you read the book properly, it actually reveals that when he's talking about nothingness, he's not talking about nothingness, but in reality, he's talking about something. He's talking about a gap that is surging with activity and energy, as in there is something there, a spatial gap with activity and energy, in which fine particles come and go. So that's not nothingness. That's that's something. It's an actual nothingness would be where there is nothing, right? Nothing in existence. So to use something as an explanation doesn't explain the argument, which is about nothingness. And therefore the question remains, how did the universe, or even this surge of activity and energy that Lawrence Krauss is talking about, how did it come about? And the most Krauss did was just play on words by defining nothingness with his own personal definition, in order for him to turn around and dictate to us about how something can emerge from nothing. But in reality, what he is explaining is not nothing, and is actually something. So, and again, there's been various scholars and writers and scientists and others who've actually written in detail responding to this particular position of Lawrence Krauss. In fact, even in one of the debates when Dawkins was challenged about Krauss's position, even he found it deeply problematic, because to try and claim something from nothing is, of course, common sense, and it doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. And that's why his arguments was not accepted, and his book has been criticized by various different writers. I'm going to end here on this point. The next one, which is, again, I wanted to look about in more detail, and maybe we'll take it separately, which is the common objection, which is, who created Allah? Right? That's, I guess, the most important final objection, and inshallah, that's the objection we'll look at in more detail next week. If you have any questions, inshallah, we can take your questions now.